The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Josiah Hayes rode into Clifton, Wyoming territory, 1876, his weary body swaying with each plodding step of his chestnut stallion. He had nothing but $20 to his name, the clothes on his back, and a troubled past he'd been out running for the better part of 2 years. The small mining town, nestled in the shadow of rugged mountains, represented his last chance at something resembling redemption, or at least a hot meal, and a bed that wasn't the hard Wyoming ground. Josiah guided his horse down the town's main street, taking in the familiar sights of any frontier settlement. The general store, saloon, blacksmith, and small church whose white steeple rose defiantly against the encroaching darkness. Dust swirled around the hooves of his horse as he passed the last few townspeople hurrying to finish their business before nightfall. As he approached the livery stable at the far end of town, a sound caught his attention, soft, heartbreaking sobs coming from behind the weathered building. Josiah hesitated. A man with good sense would mind his own business, especially a man with secrets. But something about the raw anguish in those cries pulled at him like a physical force. Dismounting with a soft groan, his muscles protesting after the long ride, Josiah tied his horse to the hitching post and followed the sound. Behind the stable, sitting on an upturned crate with her face buried in her hands, was a young woman. Her shoulders shook with each sob, her honey-brown hair falling in disarray around her tear-streaked face. Josiah cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Madam, are you all right?" The woman's head jerked up, revealing swollen eyes and a face that, despite its current distress, struck Josiah as uncommonly beautiful. She hastily wiped at her tears, embarrassment coloring her features as she struggled to compose herself. "I'm fine," she said, her voice breaking on the obvious lie. "Please, just go away." Instead of leaving, Josiah took a step closer, removing his hat respectfully. "I don't mean to intrude, but it seems to me that folks who are fine don't usually cry behind livery stables." A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes. "Everything," she whispered. "I've lost everything." The raw pain in her voice struck him like a physical blow. He'd heard that kind of desolation before, had felt it himself once. "What's your name, madam?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering. Beatrice Sullivan, Miss Sullivan, I'm Josiah Hayes." He knelt down to her level, keeping a respectful distance. "I don't know what you've lost, and I won't pry if you don't want to share it, but there's one thing I do know." "What's that?" she asked, a note of bitterness creeping into her voice. "You've still got tomorrow," Josiah said simply, "and sometimes that's enough to start with." Beatrice looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing past the trail dust and worn clothing to something underneath. For a moment her tears stopped. "Tomorrow," she repeated, testing the word like it was a foreign language. "Yes, madam, tomorrow and the day after that." He offered a small smile. "Now, can I help you get someplace safe for the night? It's getting dark and this ain't the most comfortable spot in town." Beatrice wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't have anywhere to go. The bank foreclosed on my father's ranch today. 20 years of his life gone in an afternoon." Fresh tears threatened. "He died 3 months ago and I couldn't keep up with the payments. They wouldn't even give me time to sell the livestock properly. Everything's gone." Josiah's jaw tightened. He'd seen it happen too many times, banks swooping in like vultures when honest folk hit hard times. "Do you have family in town, friends who might take you in?" She shook her head. "We kept to ourselves mostly. Pa was not one for socializing, and the few friends I have are barely getting by themselves." The smart thing would be to tip his hat, offer condolences, and continue on his way. Josiah Hayes hadn't survived this long by taking on other people's problems, but something about Beatrice Sullivan's quiet dignity, even in despair, made walking away impossible. "There's a boarding house at the end of Oak Street," he said. "Mrs. Abernathy runs it. I was heading there myself. Let me pay for a room for you just for tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Suspicion flashed in her eyes. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" It was a fair question. Men didn't offer help without wanting something in return. That was a lesson every woman on the frontier learned early. Because someone did the same for me once when I needed it, Josiah answered truthfully. And because no one should have to sleep behind a stable when they've just lost everything. Beatrice studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. One night, she agreed, and I'll pay you back somehow. We'll worry about that tomorrow, he said, offering his hand to help her up. As she placed her delicate hand in his calloused one, Josiah felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: a connection, fragile as spider silk, but undeniably present. They walked in silence to retrieve his horse, and then made their way down the darkening street toward the boarding house. Josiah couldn't help but notice how Beatrice held her head high despite her red-rimmed eyes and the curious glances of passing townspeople. Mrs. Abernathy was a plump, no-nonsense widow who ran the cleanest boarding house in 3 counties. Her shrewd eyes took in Beatrice's distress and Josiah's travel-worn appearance, but she asked no questions as she handed over 2 room keys. Breakfast is at 7 sharp, she informed them. No exceptions, no visitors after 9, and absolutely no smoking indoors. Josiah paid for both rooms from his meager funds. As they climbed the narrow staircase, Beatrice turned to him. Thank you, she said quietly, not just for the room, but for what you said about tomorrow. Get some rest, Miss Sullivan, he replied. Things have a way of looking different in the morning light. She nodded, disappearing into her room. Josiah entered his own Spartan accommodations, sinking onto the narrow bed with a weary sigh. He hadn't planned on playing Good Samaritan tonight or ever again, if he was honest. His own life was complicated enough without taking on someone else's troubles. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, it was Beatrice's face that followed him into dreams, and the feeling that tomorrow might indeed hold something worth waking up for. The next morning, Josiah rose before dawn out of habit. Years of ranch work and then life on the trail had made early risers of men like him. He washed his face in the chipped basin, ran fingers through his dark hair, and considered his next move. The smart play would be to check on Miss Sullivan, ensure she was settled, then continue on his way. The job he'd heard about at the Broken Spur Ranch north of town was what had drawn him to Clifton in the first place. He needed work, his dwindling funds wouldn't last another week. But as he made his way downstairs, he found Beatrice already seated at the dining table, hands wrapped around a steaming coffee cup, her expression contemplative. She looked different in the morning light, still beautiful, but with a determined set to her jaw that hadn't been visible through yesterday's tears. Morning, Miss Sullivan, he greeted, taking a seat across from her. Mr. Hayes, she nodded, her eyes were still puffy but clear. I want to thank you again for your kindness last night. Before he could respond, Mrs. Abernathy appeared with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, setting them down with efficient movements. Eat up, she instructed. Nothing worse than cold breakfast. When she'd bustled back to the kitchen, Beatrice spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said about tomorrow. She took a breath. I need to find work immediately. I have some experience as a seamstress and I can cook reasonably well. Do you think there might be opportunities in town? Josiah considered as he cut into his eggs. Possible. Clifton's growing with the mines doing well. Mrs. Hawkins at the general store might know of something. He hesitated. If you don't mind my asking, what skills do you have from running the ranch? A small smile touched her lips for the first time. Everything. Pa believed a woman should know how to do a man's work if needed. I can ride, rope, tend livestock, keep books. I've delivered calves and foals, mended fences in blizzards, and negotiated with the most stubborn cattle buyers this side of the Mississippi. Josiah's estimation of her rose considerably. That's impressive, but not particularly useful for a woman alone in town, she replied practically. No one will hire me to do men's work when there are men looking for jobs. He knew she was right. The frontier might force women to learn traditionally male skills, but that didn't mean society welcomed them using those skills professionally. What about your ranch? He asked. Is there no way to save it? Beatrice's face clouded. The bank wants $500 by the end of the month, or they'll sell it to the highest bidder. They already have interest from the triple R spread they've been trying to absorb smaller ranches for years. Her fingers tightened around her cup. I could earn that much eventually, but not in 3 weeks. An idea formed in Josiah's mind, not a good one, certainly not a prudent one, but one that tugged at him nonetheless. "What if," he said slowly, "you had help?" Her brow furrowed. "What kind of help?" "I'm heading to the Broken Spur today to inquire about work, but I've been a ranch hand most of my life. I know cattle, horses, and how to turn a profit from both." He leaned forward. "What if, instead of looking for work in town, we tried to make your ranch productive enough to pay off the bank?" Beatrice stared at him. "You can't be serious. You don't even know me." "I know you've lost something important and aren't ready to give up on it," he replied. "I know what that feels like." "Why would you do this? What's in it for you?" Josiah considered his answer carefully. "A fair wage if we succeed, a place to work for a few weeks if we don't, and maybe—" He hesitated, "maybe a chance to help someone hold onto something that matters when I couldn't do the same for myself once." Suspicion warred with hope in her expression. "What would this arrangement look like?" "Practically speaking, I'll work for room, board, and 20% of whatever profit we can generate," he offered. "You remain in complete control of your property and decisions. I'm just hired help with a stake in the outcome." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment. "The house is small," she finally said. "You'd need to stay in the bunkhouse. It's not much, but it's shelter. I've slept in worse places. And there's another problem," she continued. "The bank seized most of the livestock already. We're down to just 12 head of cattle, 2 milk cows, and 4 horses." Josiah whistled low. "That's not much to work with." "It's why I was crying," she admitted. "It seems impossible," he thought for a moment. "What else is on the property, land, resources?" 200 acres, a small apple orchard my mother planted years ago, good water from the creek. We were doing well until the drought last year killed half our herd, and then Pa got sick." She trailed off. "Is the property intact? Fences, barn, equipment?" She nodded. "Yes, though some repairs are needed." Josiah sat back, calculating. It was a long shot, but not impossible. "Here's what I propose. Let's ride out today, assess what we have to work with, and make a plan. If it seems hopeless after a proper look, you're no worse off than you are now. You can still come back to town and look for work as a seamstress." Hope and fear battled across Beatrice's face. Finally, she extended her hand across the table. "All right, Mr. Hayes, you have a deal." His larger hand closed around hers. "Josiah," he corrected. "If we're going to be business partners, you should call me Josiah." "Then you must call me Beatrice," she replied with unexpected firmness. An hour later, they were riding out of town, Josiah on his chestnut stallion and Beatrice on a bay mare, borrowed from the livery with a promise of payment within the month. The morning was clear and cool, the September sun warming their backs as they traveled the winding road that followed Rattlesnake Creek away from town. "It's about 5 miles, Beatrice explained, her voice stronger now that they were heading toward home. "Sullivan's Crossing, Pa called it, because the creek narrows enough at our property that you can easily cross over." As they rode, she told him more about the ranch, how her father had built it from nothing after coming west from Pennsylvania 20 years ago, how her mother had died of fever when Beatrice was 12, how they'd survived and even thrived until the combination of drought and illness had broken them. "Pa refused to ask for help," she said softly. "Even when he was dying, he insisted we could weather it alone. Sullivan pride, he called it." She glanced at Josiah. "I'm trying to be wiser than that." "There's a difference between pride and stubbornness," he agreed. "Though I've been guilty of both myself." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the Sullivan Ranch came into view below them. Even from a distance, Josiah could see it had once been a prosperous homestead. The main house was modest but solid, with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. A large barn, corral, and several outbuildings were arranged in a practical layout. Beyond them stretched fenced pastures, a small orchard, and in the distance, the glint of water where the creek ran through the property. But the signs of recent hardship were equally visible. The paint on the house was peeling, several fence sections needed repair, and the normally busy yard of a working ranch seemed eerily quiet with so few animals. Beatrice took a deep breath as she surveyed her home. It looks smaller somehow. "It looks like a good ranch that's had some bad luck," Josiah observed honestly. Nothing that can't be fixed with work and time. If they had time, which they didn't, they rode down to the house, and Beatrice dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent their life on horseback. Josiah followed, taking in more details as they approached. The porch steps needed replacing, the corral gate hung at an awkward angle, and weeds had begun to claim the vegetable garden beside the house. "Let me show you around," Beatrice offered, her natural pride in her home evident despite its current state. The tour confirmed Josiah's initial assessment. The Sullivan Ranch had good bones, solid construction, thoughtful layout, and excellent water access, but it had suffered from months of neglect as Beatrice's father had grown too ill to maintain it, and she had been stretched thin trying to care for him and keep things running. The livestock situation was as dire as she described. The 12 remaining cattle were decent quality Herefords, but nowhere near enough to generate the income they needed. The 4 horses, 2 working geldings, a broodmare, and an aging stallion were well bred but past their prime. The milk cows, at least, were healthy and productive. The inside of the barn revealed more resources: tack in good repair, basic blacksmithing tools, and farming implements. The tack room held saddles, bridles, and working gear. Pa was always organized, Beatrice explained, running her hand along a neatly arranged row of tools. Said a ranch runs on its routines. When they reached the small bunkhouse, Josiah noted it was clean but Spartan: 4 bunks, a small stove, a table, and chairs. It had clearly been some time since the Sullivans had been able to afford additional hired hands. The main house was the heart of the property. Despite its modest size, it was comfortable and homey. Beatrice had kept it meticulously clean, even as everything else began to fall apart. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with 2 small bedrooms extending off one side. "It's not much," she said, a hint of embarrassment coloring her voice as she watched Josiah take in the simple furnishings. "It's a home," he replied with genuine appreciation. "That's worth more than fancy things." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared values. They settled at the kitchen table, and Beatrice produced a leather-bound ledger from a nearby shelf. "These are the ranch accounts," she explained, opening it to reveal neat columns of figures. "Pa taught me bookkeeping early on. I can show you exactly where we stand." For the next hour, they pored over the numbers together. The situation was grim, but not entirely hopeless. The drought and Charles Sullivan's illness had drained their savings, and the bank payments had fallen behind when medical expenses mounted. "The land itself is worth far more than what we owe," Beatrice said bitterly. "But the bank knows that. They want the property, not the money." Josiah nodded, familiar with the practice. Whitley at the bank, he connected to the R in some way. His brother-in-law is the foreman there, she confirmed, figured as much. Josiah studied the numbers again. "All right, we need to think creatively. $500 in 3 weeks isn't possible from the cattle alone, not with just 12 head. "What about the orchard?" he asked suddenly. "You mentioned apple trees." Beatrice brightened slightly. "Yes, about 50 trees. They're producing well this year. The drought didn't affect them as much since they're close to the creek." Her brow furrowed. "But I can't possibly pick and sell enough apples in time." "Maybe not alone," Josiah said, "but we could organize an apple harvest. Sell some fresh in town, press the rest for cider." He tapped his fingers on the table. "What about your father's connections? Any favors you can call in?" Beatrice shook her head. Pa was respected but kept to himself. He didn't believe in owing or being owed. Josiah continued thinking aloud. "The cattle we can't sell, yet they'll fetch a better price with a bit more fattening up. The horses." He paused. "How good is that stallion? Breeding quality?" "Apollo. He's getting older, but he's thrown some of the finest colts in the county. Strong bloodlines." "There's potential there," Josiah mused. "We might be able to arrange some breeding fees." He sat back. "We need a multi-pronged approach, some immediate income, some medium-term investments, and we need to make this place look prosperous again, quickly." Beatrice tilted her head. "Why does appearance matter if we're focused on generating income?" "Because," Josiah explained. If the bank thinks we're failing, they'll be inflexible. If they think we're turning things around, they might extend the deadline. Perception matters almost as much as reality. A small smile curved Beatrice's lips. You've done this before. It wasn't a question, but Josiah answered anyway, once or twice. Hard times find everyone eventually. She nodded, then stood with sudden determination. All right, let's get to work. Daylight's wasting. They spent the remainder of the day tackling the most visible repairs, fixing the corral gate, clearing the overgrown path to the house, and mending the broken front steps. By sunset, they were exhausted but had made noticeable progress. The ranch already looked more lived in, more cared for. Beatrice cooked a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches. They ate on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Thank you, Beatrice said quietly, for believing this is possible when I nearly gave up. Josiah looked at her, really looked at her in the fading light, her strength, her determination, the way she refused to be defined by her losses. I think you would have figured it out on your own, he said honestly. You don't strike me as someone who stays down for long. Maybe, she conceded. But it helps not to be alone. The simple statement hung in the air between them, filled with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. I should turn in, Josiah said finally, rising to his feet. Morning comes early on a ranch. Yes, Beatrice agreed. Good night, Josiah. The bunkhouse should have everything you need, but let me know if there's anything missing. He tipped his hat and headed toward the small building, aware of her watching him until he closed the door behind him. Alone in the quiet bunkhouse, Josiah sat heavily on one of the bunks. What was he doing? Getting involved in Beatrice Sullivan's problems wasn't going to solve his own. Yet something about her courage, her refusal to accept defeat, resonated with him deeply. He removed his boots and stretched out on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow they would begin the real work of saving this place. As the sun rose the next morning, Josiah was already awake and planning. He'd spent part of the night thinking through their options, and by the time he emerged from the bunkhouse, he had the beginnings of a strategy. He found Beatrice in the barn, finishing the morning milking. She looked up as he entered, her face flushed from exertion but her eyes clearer than they had been since he'd met her. Good morning, she greeted. There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some before breakfast. Already had a cup, he replied. I've been thinking about our approach. We need to divide and conquer. She rose, carrying the milk pail. I'm listening. I'll focus on the cattle and fences today. They need better grazing if we're going to improve their condition quickly. He followed her as she headed toward the house. Meanwhile, those apples need picking. The sooner we get them to market, the better price they'll fetch, Beatrice nodded. I can handle the orchard, but even working together, we can only do so much in a day. Which is why, Josiah continued, I think we should ride into town tomorrow and see who we can hire for specific tasks. Not full-time hands, we can't afford that, but day labor for the harvesting at least. She looked skeptical. With what money? We'll offer a percentage of the apple sales instead of upfront payment. It's a gamble, but people might take it. Beatrice considered this as she strained the milk into clean crocks. It could work, and I could see if Mrs. Hawkins would be willing to sell some of our apples at the general store. Exactly, Josiah agreed. We need to create multiple streams of income quickly. Over breakfast, they refined their plan. Josiah would repair the most critical fences and move the cattle to better pasture. He would also assess what might fetch a good price in town extra tack, tools they could spare, anything to generate immediate cash. Beatrice would harvest as many apples as she could manage alone, tend to the vegetable garden which still had pumpkins and late squash reaching maturity, and gather eggs from the small flock of chickens that had somehow escaped the bank's notice. They worked separately but with shared purpose throughout the day. Josiah found himself impressed by Beatrice's stamina and determination. From his vantage point mending fences, he could see her in the orchard methodically filling baskets with apples, pausing only briefly to wipe sweat from her brow before continuing. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Josiah finished securing the cattle in their new pasture and headed back to help Beatrice bring in the day's harvest before the rain hit. He found her struggling to carry 2 heavy baskets from the orchard. Without a word, he took them from her. "Thank you," she said, flexing her fingers. "I've picked nearly 8 bushels, so far the trees are more productive than I remembered." "That's good news," Josiah replied as they hurried toward the barn. "Quality looks good, too." They had just stored the last of the baskets when the rain began heavy drops that quickly turned into a steady downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they made a dash for the house. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked. Beatrice's hair had come loose from its practical bun, falling in damp waves around her face. She laughed the first real laugh Josiah had heard from her as she wrung water from her skirt. "Perfect timing," she said, gesturing him inside. "We should change into dry clothes before we catch our death." Josiah hesitated. "I'll head to the bunkhouse. Don't be ridiculous," Beatrice interrupted. "You'll drown getting there in this downpour. I have some of my father's clothes that might fit you." Before he could protest, she disappeared into one of the bedrooms, returning moments later with a folded shirt and trousers. "These should do. You can change in Pa's room." She pointed to the second bedroom. "I'll change in mine." Josiah took the offered clothing and entered Charles Sullivan's room. It was neat but clearly untouched since its owner's passing a pocket watch on the nightstand, a pair of reading glasses beside a worn Bible, boots lined up precisely under the bed. He changed quickly, feeling like an intruder despite Beatrice's permission. Charles Sullivan's shirt was a bit tight across the shoulders, but the trousers fit well enough. Josiah gathered his wet clothes and returned to the main room. Beatrice had also changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She had built up the fire in the small stove, and the room was beginning to warm. "I've hung a line in the kitchen for our wet things," she said, taking his clothes and disappearing around the corner. When she returned, she added, "The rain's a blessing, actually. The pasture needs it, and it saves us watering the garden." They spent the evening by the fire, planning their trip to town the next day and discussing which items they might sell for quick cash. Josiah noticed how Beatrice's knowledge of the ranch's operations was comprehensive. She knew exactly what they could spare and what was essential. "Your father taught you well," he observed as she detailed the equipment inventory. A shadow crossed her face. "He had to. After Mother died, it was just the 2 of us. He always said a Sullivan should be prepared for anything." "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said softly. "Stubborn as a mule, but fair and honest. He would have liked you, I think." Josiah wasn't so sure about that. Fathers rarely approved of drifters with mysterious pasts, but he accepted the compliment with a nod. The rain continued through the night, a steady drumming on the roof that made the house feel smaller, more intimate. As they sat across from each other, the fire casting warm light between them, Josiah found himself studying Beatrice's face, the determined set of her chin, the intelligence in her eyes, the way her mouth curved when she was thinking. She caught him looking and held his gaze for a moment before turning away, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I should check if our clothes have dried," she said, standing abruptly. When she returned, the easy camaraderie of earlier had been replaced by a subtle tension. They finished their planning in more businesslike tones, and when the rain finally slackened, Josiah excused himself to the bunkhouse, feeling oddly reluctant to leave the warmth of her home. The next morning dawned clear and fresh after the rain. They rode into Clifton early, their wagon loaded with apples, eggs, and items to sell. Beatrice wore her best dress, faded but still presentable, and had arranged her hair neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Their first stop was the general store where Mrs. Hawkins, a thin, sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for fairness, examined their apples with a critical eye. "Good quality," she admitted. "I can take 4 bushels on consignment. You'll get 60% of whatever they sell for." It wasn't the most generous offer, but it was fair. Beatrice agreed readily. "And I'll take all your eggs at the usual price," Mrs. Hawkins added, counting out coins into Beatrice's palm. As they were concluding their business, the store's bell jangled, announcing a new customer. Josiah turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in expensive riding clothes enter. He was accompanied by a younger man who bore a striking resemblance, clearly his son. Mrs. Hawkins straightened. "Mr. Russell, Frederick, what can I help you with today, Russell, the Triple R Ranch?" Josiah glanced at Beatrice, whose face had gone carefully blank. "Just some supplies, Mrs. Hawkins," the older Russell replied jovially. His eyes fell on Beatrice, and his expression shifted to one of practiced sympathy. "Miss Sullivan, I was sorry to hear about your recent troubles with the bank." Beatrice inclined her head stiffly. "Mr. Russell, I want you to know," he continued, "that if your property does change hands, we treat it with the same care your father did." "How thoughtful," Beatrice replied, her voice cold. "But that won't be necessary. We're managing quite well." Russell's gaze shifted to Josiah, assessing. "I don't believe we've met Mr. Hayes, Josiah Hayes." He didn't offer his hand. "Mr. Hayes is helping me with the ranch," Beatrice explained, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. Russell's son, Frederick, who had been examining Beatrice with unconcealed interest, stepped forward. "If you need any assistance, Miss Sullivan, the Triple R would be happy to help. Perhaps I could call on you sometime to discuss it." The offer was thinly veiled, and Josiah felt a surge of protective irritation. "As I said, we're managing well," Beatrice repeated firmly. "Good day, gentlemen." She turned back to Mrs. Hawkins to finalize their arrangements, effectively dismissing the Russells. Frederick's expression darkened at the snub, but his father placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Good day, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hayes." With a tip of his hat, the elder Russell led his son to the other side of the store. Once they were out of earshot, Mrs. Hawkins leaned forward. "Be careful with those two," she murmured. "James Russell has been trying to expand his holdings for years, and his son is even more ambitious. They've got half the county in their pocket, including Thomas Whitley at the bank." "We've noticed," Beatrice replied dryly. With their business at the general store concluded, they moved on to the blacksmith, where Josiah negotiated the sale of some extra tools from the ranch. Then to the saloon, where the owner agreed to buy any cider they could produce, and finally to the livery stable, where they arranged potential breeding services for Apollo. By midday, they had accumulated a modest sum of cash and lined up several potential income sources. More importantly, they had made it known around town that Sullivan's Crossing was back in business. Their final stop was the Clifton Gazette, the town's small newspaper. Josiah suggested placing a notice about the apple harvest, offering a share of the proceeds to anyone willing to help. "It's worth a try," Beatrice agreed, though she looked doubtful. The newspaper office was cramped but tidy. The editor, a bespectacled man named Wilson, listened to their proposal with interest. "I can run your notice in tomorrow's edition," he agreed. "And I might know some folks who'd be interested. The mining company laid off some men last week. They'd be glad for the work." As they were leaving, Wilson called after them. "Miss Sullivan, I was sorry about your father. He was a good man. Helped me repair my printing press once when no one else in town could figure it out." Beatrice's expression softened. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. He always spoke highly of your newspaper." Outside, as they loaded their purchases onto the wagon, Beatrice seemed lost in thought. "What is it?" Josiah asked. "I was just thinking about what Mr. Wilson said about Pa helping him." She glanced around the bustling town. "Maybe Pa wasn't as isolated as I thought. Maybe there are more connections here than I realized." Josiah nodded. "People remember kindness and they remember fairness. Your father seems to have offered both." As they prepared to leave town, Frederick Russell appeared suddenly beside their wagon, his expression now charming. "Miss Sullivan, before you go, I wanted to apologize if I seemed forward earlier." He smiled, revealing even white teeth. "My father and I only want to help. Perhaps you'd allow me to call on you properly? Say, this Sunday." Beatrice hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sudden change in manner. Before she could respond, Josiah stepped closer to her side. "We appreciate the thought," he said evenly, "but we've got a busy week ahead. The ranch needs our full attention." Frederick's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened as they moved between Josiah and Beatrice. "I see. Well, the offer stands." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Sullivan." As they drove the wagon out of town, Beatrice gave Josiah a sidelong glance. "That was presumptuous of you." "Turning him down?" Josiah asked, keeping his eyes on the road, making it sound as though we had decided together, as though you had any say in who calls on me. Josiah's hands tightened on the reins. "You're right, I apologize." They rode in silence for a while before Beatrice spoke again. "Why did you do it?" He considered his answer carefully. "Frederick Russell strikes me as a man used to getting what he wants. And what he wants right now is your land, not your company." "You don't think he finds me attractive?" she challenged, a hint of vulnerability beneath the defiance. Josiah gave her a long look. "I think any man with eyes would find you attractive, Miss Sullivan. But that doesn't mean his intentions are honorable." Color rose in her cheeks, and she turned to look at the passing landscape. "Well, it doesn't matter anyway. I have no time for courting, not with the ranch at stake." The rest of the journey passed in companionable silence. As they approached Sullivan's Crossing, Beatrice pointed out landmarks, the best fishing spot on the creek, the ridge where wildflowers bloomed in spring, the old oak tree where she'd built a childhood swing. Josiah listened, gradually building a picture of her life here, understanding more deeply why she fought so hard to keep it. When they reached the ranch, they unloaded their supplies and then turned to the next task, preparing for potential harvest helpers. Beatrice cleared the bunkhouse for workers while Josiah checked the cider press in the barn, ensuring it was functional after months of disuse. They worked until sunset, stopping only when the light became too dim to continue. Over a simple dinner, they calculated their progress. "We've made a good start," Josiah concluded. "If we get help with the harvest and if the cattle fatten up as they should, we might just make it." Beatrice nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "And if we don't?" Josiah met her gaze steadily. "Then we'll have tried everything possible." "But I'm not ready to accept defeat yet, and I don't think you are either." Her answering smile, though small, contained renewed determination. "No, I'm not." The next few days fell into a rhythm of hard work and careful planning. 3 men from town responded to their notice in the Gazette, former miners grateful for any income. With their help, the apple harvest progressed rapidly. Josiah split his time between supervising the harvest and tending to the cattle and repairs. Beatrice worked alongside the men in the orchard, then spent evenings turning the lower-quality apples into cider and preserves. By the end of the week, they had sold most of the fresh apples and the first batch of cider, bringing in nearly $200. It wasn't enough yet, but it was progress. On Sunday, they gave their hired hands the day off, as was customary. Josiah took the opportunity to ride the property boundaries, checking fences and getting a better sense of the land's potential. When he returned in the late afternoon, he found Beatrice sitting on the porch steps, staring at a letter in her hands. "Bad news?" he asked, dismounting. She looked up, her expression troubled. "It's from the bank. Mr. Whitley says he's reviewed our situation and is regretfully unable to extend our deadline. In fact, he's moved it up. We now have only 2 weeks to pay the full amount." Josiah swore under his breath. "He can't do that." The original agreement had provisions for adjusting the timeline at the bank's discretion, Beatrice finished. "Pa signed it when he was desperate for funds to cover his medical expenses. I didn't realize what it meant at the time." Josiah sat beside her on the steps. "This is Russell's doing. He must have realized we're making progress." "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Josiah thought for a moment. "We continue as planned, but accelerate everything, and we look for additional income sources." He hesitated. "There's one option we haven't discussed, your father's stallion Apollo. If he's as good as you say, we might be able to sell him outright rather than just his services." Beatrice's head snapped up. "No, absolutely not. Apollo was Pa's pride. He raised him from a colt." "I understand," Josiah said gently, "but we need to consider all options. A stallion of good bloodlines could fetch a significant sum." "It's not about the money," she insisted. It's the last connection to Pa's dreams for this place, the bloodline he worked so hard to develop." Josiah nodded, not pushing further. "All right, we'll find another way." The determination in his voice seemed to steady her. "Yes, we will." As the sun began to set, painting the hills in gold and amber, they remained sitting side by side on the porch steps, shoulders not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's presence. "Tell me about your father," Josiah said after a while. "What kind of man was he?" Beatrice's expression softened. "Principled, hardworking. He believed in building something that would last, something he could be proud of." She glanced at Josiah. "He came west with nothing but determination and a dream of land of his own. Met my mother in Denver, convinced her to join his crazy adventure. She must have loved him very much." "She did." Beatrice smiled at some memory. "They were partners in everything. After she died, something in him changed. He became more solitary, but he was still a good father, taught me everything he knew." "He did well," Josiah observed quietly. Beatrice turned to study his face in the fading light. "What about your family? You never mention them." Josiah looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "Not much to tell. My father was a rancher in Texas, strict, exacting. Nothing was ever good enough." He shrugged. "My mother tried to soften him, but she died when I was 14. I left home at 17 and never looked back. No siblings. A brother, 2 years younger, haven't seen him in years." Beatrice absorbed this. "Is that why you understand what it means to lose something important? Because you lost your family, in a way," Josiah admitted. "Though in my case, the leaving was my choice, not like your situation." "Still a loss," she said gently. The simple understanding in her voice threatened to unravel something tightly wound inside him. Josiah stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses before dark." Beatrice watched him go, aware that he had revealed more than he intended and was now retreating. She understood the impulse all too well. The next morning, they were awakened by the sound of approaching horses. Josiah emerged from the bunkhouse, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip, to find James Russell and his son riding into the yard, accompanied by Thomas Whitley from the bank. Beatrice appeared on the porch, hastily pinning up her hair. "Mr. Russell, this is an unexpected visit." Russell dismounted with the ease of a lifelong horseman. "Miss Sullivan, I hope we're not interrupting." "As a matter of fact, we were just preparing to start the day's work," she replied coolly. Whitley, a thin man with nervous hands, dismounted more awkwardly. "Miss Sullivan, I wanted to discuss the letter I sent regarding your loan." "I received it," Beatrice said, "though I fail to see why the terms needed to change when we've been making such good progress toward payment." "The bank has obligations to its shareholders," Whitley began, not meeting her eyes. "Given the current economic climate, given my brother-in-law's interest in the property," Josiah interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside Beatrice. Whitley flushed. Russell merely looked amused. "Business is business, Mr. Hayes," Russell said smoothly. "But actually, we're here with a proposition that might benefit Miss Sullivan." He gestured to the ranch. "I've been impressed with the improvements you've made in a short time. It shows initiative." "Thank you," Beatrice replied cautiously. "So I'd like to make an offer," Russell continued. "I'll pay off your debt to the bank, the full $500 plus an additional $300 for your personal use." Beatrice stiffened. "My ranch isn't for sale." "Please hear me out," Russell insisted. $800 is a generous sum. You could start fresh, perhaps open that seamstress shop in town I've heard you have talent for. Or, Frederick interjected, stepping closer, you could consider another arrangement. My father isn't getting any younger, and I'll be taking over the R soon. A ranch that size needs a mistress. His gaze traveled over Beatrice in a way that made Josiah's jaw clench. Someone with your knowledge of ranching would be an ideal wife. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I will not sell my father's legacy, and I certainly won't trade it for a wedding ring. This conversation is over." Frederick's expression hardened. "You should consider your position carefully, Miss Sullivan. A woman alone has limited options in this territory." "She's not alone," Josiah stated, taking a deliberate step closer to Beatrice. Russell's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "I see. Well, the offer stands until your deadline. After that, I'm afraid the price will be considerably lower when we buy it from the bank at auction." As the three men mounted their horses to leave, Russell paused. That's a fine stallion you have, by the way. Apollo, isn't it? Excellent bloodlines. Shame if he ended up at auction too. The threat was thinly veiled. Josiah felt Beatrice tense beside him, but she said nothing until the men had ridden out of sight. The audacity, she finally hissed, hands clenched at her sides. To think I would, that Frederick would. Words failed her. They're desperate, Josiah observed. Which means we're doing better than they expected. Beatrice paced the yard, her anger giving way to determination. We need to work faster, harder, agreed, but we also need to be smart about this. Josiah thought for a moment. Russell mentioned Apollo specifically. That tells me something. What? He knows quality when he sees it, and he knows a breeding stallion like Apollo could be the foundation of a new bloodline. Josiah's mind was racing ahead. We can use that. Over the next hour, they formulated a new plan. Rather than selling Apollo or simply offering his services for stud fees, they would organize a small horse auction, featuring Apollo as the star but not actually for sale. The event would attract serious horse buyers from surrounding areas, people with money to spend who might also be interested in their other horses or cattle. It's risky, Beatrice admitted. What if no one comes? We make sure they do, Josiah replied. We advertise in the regional papers, not just the Gazette. We turn it into an event. They spent the day dividing their efforts, Beatrice continuing with the apple processing while Josiah rode to town to place advertisements and spread word about the upcoming auction. When he returned, he brought news that both encouraged and concerned them. The word is spreading already, he reported as they sat on the porch after dinner. But so are rumors, thanks to the Russells. They're telling people the ranch is failing and everything will be available at the bank auction in 2 weeks. Beatrice sighed in frustration. They're trying to undermine our auction before it even happens. Yes, but there's a silver lining, Josiah pointed out. Several people in town mentioned they'd rather buy from you directly than see the Triple R expand further. Russell isn't as popular as he thinks. That's something, at least, Beatrice conceded. The next few days were a flurry of activity. While continuing the apple harvest and cider production, they also prepared for the auction, grooming the horses to gleaming perfection, repairing the corral where they would be displayed, and cleaning up the ranch yard to make it as presentable as possible. Their hired hands, seeing the determination of the young ranch owner and her partner, began working with increased dedication. Word spread through town about the Sullivan Ranch's fight to survive, and gradually, small gestures of support appeared. A basket of baked goods from Mrs. Abernathy, spare lumber from the carpenter for repairs, offers of help with the auction from townspeople who remembered Charles Sullivan's kindnesses. 5 days before their bank deadline, they held the auction. The turnout exceeded their expectations, not just locals, but buyers from as far as Cheyenne and Laramie, drawn by the reputation of Apollo's bloodline. Josiah, who had experience with livestock auctions, served as the auctioneer. Beatrice, dressed in her mother's best dress carefully altered to fit her slender frame, moved among the crowd, answering questions about the horses and the ranch with knowledge and grace. The auction began with their 2 working geldings, which sold for better prices than they had dared hope. The aging broodmare went next, purchased by a neighboring rancher who recognized her quality despite her years. As promised, Apollo was presented but identified as display only, a tactic that, as Josiah had predicted, only increased interest in his bloodline. By mid-afternoon, they had secured several breeding arrangements for Apollo at premium fees, sold their remaining cattle at good prices to buyers who were already there for the horses, and even sold futures on next spring's apple crop. When the last buyer had departed, Beatrice and Josiah counted their earnings in the kitchen. The total, combined with their previous apple and cider sales, came to just over $470. We're still short, Beatrice said, staring at the pile of bills and coins. But not by much, Josiah reminded her. And we have 3 days until the deadline. The last of the cider will be ready tomorrow. That should bring in at least $20. Beatrice nodded, but her expression remained troubled. What if the bank refuses to accept it? What if Whitley claims we're still short because of interest or fees we don't know about? It was a valid concern. Josiah had seen such tactics before. Then we get it in writing first. Tomorrow we ride into town and speak with Whitley. We get him to confirm in front of witnesses exactly what we owe and when. Beatrice agreed, and they spent the evening preparing for their confrontation with the bank. Josiah could see the toll the stress was taking on her, the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, but her determination never wavered. The next morning, they rode into Clifton with purpose, heading straight for the bank. Whitley seemed surprised to see them, especially when they requested a formal statement of the exact amount due. "This is highly irregular," he protested. "The amount was stated in my letter." "We'd like it in official bank documentation," Beatrice insisted, "with your signature." Reluctantly, Whitley produced the paperwork, confirming the amount of $500 due in 3 days' time. "We'll be back to pay in full," Beatrice informed him, taking the document. "And we'll expect a receipt and the release of any claim on our property." Outside the bank, they proceeded with the rest of their plan. They sold the last batch of cider to the saloon, collected final payments for apples from the general store, and even managed to arrange one more breeding fee for Apollo from a late-arriving horse buyer. By the afternoon, they had secured the remaining funds needed, plus a small cushion. Rather than risk keeping the money at the ranch, they deposited it with Mrs. Hawkins at the general store for safekeeping until the bank deadline. As they prepared to leave town, a commotion near the livery stable caught their attention. Frederick Russell was engaged in a heated argument with one of the horse buyers who had attended their auction. That bloodline was promised to the Triple R, Frederick was insisting. "My father had an arrangement with Sullivan before he died." "Not what I heard," the buyer replied calmly, "and the daughter seems to have no knowledge of such an arrangement." Frederick's face flushed with anger. "She's being misled by that drifter she's taken up with. Hayes is using her to get the ranch for himself." Josiah felt Beatrice stiffen beside him. Before he could suggest they avoid the confrontation, she was striding toward the men, her head high. "Mr. Lawson," she greeted the buyer politely. "I trust you're satisfied with your breeding arrangement for Apollo." "Very much so, Miss Sullivan," Lawson replied, tipping his hat. "Looking forward to seeing what his bloodline produces with my mares." Frederick glared at them both. "This isn't over, Sullivan. A woman can't run a ranch alone, and once Hayes moves on, which men like him always do, you'll be begging for my offer." Beatrice met his gaze coolly. "Mr. Russell, I've run this ranch alone since my father fell ill nearly a year ago. I'll continue to do so, with or without help, because that's what Sullivans do. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to attend to." She turned and walked away, leaving Frederick fuming. Josiah followed, unable to suppress a smile at her composed dignity in the face of Frederick's spite. They rode home in companionable silence, the weight of imminent foreclosure finally lifting from their shoulders. The ranch, while still in need of work, was beginning to feel alive again, the fences repaired, the orchard harvested, the remaining livestock healthy and well tended. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Beatrice finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "What will you do after this is settled, after the bank is paid?" Josiah had been asking himself the same thing. 2 weeks ago, the answer would have been simple: collect his percentage, move on to the next job, the next town. That had been his pattern for years. But now, looking at Beatrice in the golden light of sunset, at the ranch they had worked together to save, the thought of leaving created an unexpected ache in his chest. "I haven't decided," he answered honestly. Beatrice nodded, not pressing further. But as the shadows lengthened, she spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "You could stay, you know. The ranch needs a foreman, someone who understands what it could be." Josiah turned to look at her, searching her face for the meaning behind the offer. "Is that what you want, a foreman?" Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I want a partner, Josiah, someone who sees the value in what my parents built, someone who helped save it when I almost gave up." She took a breath. "Someone I've grown to care for." The simple honesty of her words struck him deeply. In his years of drifting, Josiah had avoided attachments, convinced that the ghosts of his past made any future impossible. But here, with Beatrice, he had found something he hadn't realized. He was searching for not just a place, but a purpose. A connection. "There are things about my past you don't know," he said quietly. "I know enough," she replied. "I know you're a man of your word. I know you work hard and think clearly under pressure. I know you treat people fairly." Her hand moved to rest lightly on his. "The past is the past, Josiah. Remember what you told me when we first met. We've still got tomorrow." His own words coming back to him. Josiah turned his hand to clasp hers, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the marks of someone who understood hard work and sacrifice. "I'd like to stay," he said finally. "Not as your foreman, but as your partner in truth, if that's what you want." Her smile, rare and radiant, was answer enough. 3 days later, they stood together in the bank as Beatrice counted out $500 onto Whitley's desk. The banker's disappointment was poorly concealed as he wrote out the receipt and released the bank's claim on Sullivan's crossing. "Congratulations, Miss Sullivan," he said stiffly. "Your debt is paid in full." Outside, the autumn sun was bright and warm. Beatrice held the documents carefully, as if they might disappear if she loosened her grip. "It's really over," she breathed. "We did it." Josiah nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment deeper than any he'd known before. "Your father would be proud." As they walked toward their horses, James Russell and his son approached from the saloon. The elder Russell assessed them with shrewd eyes, noting the documents in Beatrice's hand. "I see congratulations are in order," he said, his tone suggesting anything but celebration. "You've managed to hold onto your little ranch." "We have," Beatrice confirmed, her chin lifting slightly. Frederick scowled. "For now, but running a ranch takes more than just paying off one debt. You'll need capital for expansion, for breeding stock." "You'll need partners who believe in the ranch's potential," Josiah interrupted. "Which we have." Russell's gaze sharpened. "So you're staying on, Hayes. Interesting. I would have wagered you'd be moving along by now." "Sorry to disappoint," Josiah replied evenly. Russell studied them both for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Well, Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hayes, it seems I underestimated your determination, and perhaps your partnership." His tone suggested he understood exactly what had developed between them. The Triple R respects worthy competitors. "Good day to you both." As the Russells walked away, Beatrice turned to Josiah with surprise. "Did he just acknowledge us as equals?" "I believe he did," Josiah confirmed. "Russell's many things, but he's a businessman at heart. He recognizes when a fight isn't worth pursuing further." "For now, at least," Beatrice added practically. "For now," Josiah agreed, "but we'll be ready." They mounted their horses and rode out of town side by side, heading home to Sullivan's Crossing, to their ranch, their future. The road ahead would have its challenges, but they would face them together. As they crested the rise that overlooked the property, Beatrice reined in her horse, taking in the view of the ranch below the house, the barn, the orchard, the pastures stretching toward the distant mountains. "When you found me crying behind the livery that night," she said thoughtfully, "I believed I'd lost everything that mattered. I couldn't see past that moment." Josiah nodded, understanding completely. Grief has a way of blinding us to possibilities. "But you were right," she continued, turning to meet his gaze. "I did have tomorrow, and now," her voice softened, "now we have all the tomorrows." Josiah reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Yes," he agreed simply, "we do." With the setting sun warming their backs, they rode down toward home. Toward the future they would build together, a future neither had imagined possible just 3 short weeks ago, when a heartbroken woman's tears had drawn a weary drifter from his solitary path. In the years that followed, Sullivan's Crossing flourished under their joint stewardship. The apple orchard expanded, the cattle herd grew, and Apollo's bloodline became known throughout the territory for producing exceptional horses. Beatrice and Josiah were married the following spring in a simple ceremony attended by most of Clifton's residents, who had come to respect the young couple's determination and integrity. They faced challenges, of course, harsh winters, market fluctuations, the continuing expansion of larger operations like the Triple R. But together, they weathered each storm, their partnership growing stronger through every trial. Their first child, a son they named Charles after Beatrice's father, arrived a year after their wedding. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah, named for Josiah's mother. The children grew up learning the same lessons their parents had: the value of hard work, the importance of keeping one's word, and the strength that comes from facing tomorrow together, no matter what it might bring. Eventually, even James Russell came to respect the success of Sullivan's Crossing, grudgingly at first, then with genuine admiration as the years passed. Frederick never fully abandoned his resentment, but his father's increasing regard for the Hayes family kept his antagonism in check. On the 10th anniversary of the day Josiah found Beatrice crying behind the livery stable, they sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over their thriving ranch. "You ever think about it?" Beatrice asked, her hand comfortably entwined with his. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't stopped that night," Josiah considered the question. "Sometimes I might still be drifting, running from the past instead of building a future." He squeezed her hand gently. "What about you?" "I might have lost everything," she said simply. "Instead, I found everything that matters." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, content in the knowledge that tomorrow and all the tomorrows yet to come would find them exactly where they belonged, together.